Staying at a cabin in the woods, you hear nothing but wind and moaning wood. But when things go completely quiet, you can be sure that something dark and disturbing has arrived. Welcome back to the Darkness Prevails podcast, where people from around the world send me their allegedly true and scary stories, and I share them with you. In today's episode, I've got cabin stories, dark villages, and even darker roads. Enjoy, and be sure to send me your scary stories for narration at darkstories.org. I'm looking for stories about the Smoky Mountains or castles. Be sure to check out eeriecast.com for even more unsettling podcasts, like our show, Freaky Folklore. Now, let's begin. Grandpa's death was something else. From Ami Dalari. This story happened 7 years ago. I was 21 years old at the time, and to this day, I still don't know what I saw. I was in college when it all started. My last class of the day was over around 8 to 9 p.m. I was tired, but still joking with my friends about how a 1-hour class turned into a 3.5-hour speech about STDs. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I felt my chest hurt like never before, and I got really sad. I had a very bad feeling, like impending doom. I got into my car and sped off to home. Physically, I was okay, but this devastating feeling was not going away. On my usual way home, I always drive under a poorly illuminated short bridge. When I passed it completely, I saw this dark creature sitting on the hood of my car watching me. It was like some sort of gargoyle, the size of a teen or so, completely dark, almost black, with unspread wings. It wasn't moving at all. It just kept watching me for a minute or so. While this was happening, I just kept driving, telling myself it's all in my mind. You're scared, that's all, I kept thinking. But deep down I knew something awful was about to happen. It felt like a confirmation of it. I don't know how, but it was like the gargoyle was telling me with its eyes, telling me, I'm sorry, it has to be this way. It will be okay. And I just kept speeding home. When I finally got there, it was dark. No lights were on outside, which was weird, because they always let them on all night. Every night. Always. I then realized my brother was looking through the blinds. He opened the door for me. His face was blank of expression. I asked where our parents were, and he said, Grandma called 30 minutes ago. Grandpa fell from the roof of the house. They went there to help. Just like that, the pressure lifted off my chest and everything clicked into place. Doomsday became real to us, because sadly, Grandfather died that night of October, due to severe brain traumatism. It truly was devastating. This is not the end, though. As a small parenthesis, I should say that my grandfather was a faithful Catholic, yet he believed and experienced paranormal things in his life. Earlier that year, around May, he was repairing the rooftop of his house when he had a heart attack. He went into surgery, and everything went okay as it could be. The cardiologist told him to wait a month before returning to activities with great effort, so he told Grandma that the roof had to wait a bit, but he was going to finish it. He promised to. I won't go anywhere before I finish it, he told her. Later on in June, one night he kept hearing his dogs barking, so we went outside to check. On the front fence, he saw a homeless man who asked for money to get something to eat. My grandpa told him to wait. He'd get him a plate with warm food. And when he turned around to go back inside the house, the guy grabbed a sawed-off shotgun from his bike and shot him. Then the man ran off without robbing or doing anything else. Grandpa went into surgery. He lost a lot of blood, so he required multiple transfusions. The surgeons had to remove 1 foot of intestine due to the injury. When we went to see him in the hospital, he somehow was cheerful and said he wasn't in any pain. Then he mentioned that he knew he had protection from above because he felt as if a shield had covered him. He knew he wasn't going to die that night, even when he was lying on the floor dragging himself and yelling to my grandmother to call 911 and to help him. Also, during our visit, he said to my grandmother, "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere until I finish that roof and leave you with no problems." The day my grandfather died, he was just finishing the roof. It was the 3rd strike. He somehow kept his promise, yet his time was out. I know it's weird, but I think that the thing I saw was there as a goodbye. I was his favorite after all. Industrial Cryptid from Backwoods in W. I live in the Pacific Northwest and am a truck driver by trade. I'm currently a local driver on one of my company's dedicated runs. I show up to work at midnight and I'm usually off between 10 a.m. to noon. There are a few important details to know. My company has our main yard at the edge of an industrial area that is backed by woods and various farm-type properties. There is a small stretch of woods between the main yard and the warehouse that we load at, and my truck usually is kept at the warehouse. So I park my personal car at the warehouse, so I'm not walking as far while carrying all my stuff. Now to the real story. A few weeks ago, I showed up for work, strapped down my load, and was sitting in my truck finishing paperwork when I noticed something run across the driveway in our loading area. I could make out a few little details. It was at least a little bit larger than a normal person, a bit pale and kind of skinny looking, running around on all fours like a bear would. When I looked up to get a good look at it, it was gone, and a small section of tree branches were swaying without any wind. I just shrugged and figured it was a regular animal, as well as a combination of still trying to wake up and light playing tricks on me. I figured I must have put a darkness prevail style filter on it, since I couldn't see it properly. Later that day, after I made all my stops and had empty cargo racks to bring back, I passed by a side street closer to the interstate, but still in the industrial area. I saw another truck, a Freightliner with a sleeper. It was stuck in the mud. I thought it was odd that they got stuck on a 2-lane road with a small stretch of grass before the wood line, but I brushed it off. After dropping off my truck and paperwork, I drove back down, passing the truck again, but this time I could see the opposite side and realized the back half of the sleeper was caved in from the bottom and the frame of the truck was bent. And it didn't come from a trailer and a jackknife. The truck had been T-boned by something on the road, but that road didn't have the space for a vehicle to go that fast, to hit it and bend the frame like that. Once again, without an explanation, I just shrugged it off and kept going. The next day, my run ended a lot earlier than usual, and I was asked to drop my truck off in the main yard for annual maintenance. So at 04:30 in the morning, I had dropped my truck off and was walking through the woods toward the warehouse to get my car. Shortly after entering the woods, I heard a sound that was similar to a dog's whine, like when it's in trouble or hurt. I turned on my light and scanned around, not finding anything weird, even though the sound was right next to me. As I walked, I could feel something watching me, but I couldn't see it. Even after I left the woods, I could tell that eyes were following me, and they continued to watch me until I got out of eyesight of the woods. Randomly for the next 2 weeks, day or night, I would feel like something was watching me, but it never felt angry and it didn't instigate fear, just curiosity. After getting a glimpse of what I thought were black, shiny eyes one morning at least 6 feet off the ground, I figured it was what I saw before, and possibly what had hit that truck. I'm just glad it doesn't seem to want to kill anyone. It just seems to be around. One more snippet. This just happened today as of writing this, and it seems to be unrelated to the industrial cryptid. When I pulled up today to my first stop, I saw a set of shoes and a hoodie lying on the ground in the middle of the drive. At first, I thought someone might have dropped them, and I didn't want to run them over with a 70,000-pound truck. So I stopped, I got out, and I noticed the shoes were pointing in the same direction. They were about a shoulder width apart, and the hoodie was directly in front. It was like someone had been lifted from their shoes and had dropped their hoodie from their hand. I later asked my supervisor and the forklift operator, who I always deal with, and they told me that it was like that when they got in, and they're not sure whose they are. I came back about 2.5 hours later, and they still didn't know. So right now my money is on aliens. And to anyone that lives in Tacoma, Fife area, do you remember any unusual lights or anything on May 2nd or May 3rd of 2021? Attacked by a wolf-like creature. From Kylie T. I don't exactly know what I saw, but they were definitely not like any animal I've ever seen. Everything I'm about to tell you is true, and I've only ever seen 2 of them in my whole life. Once when I was 10, and the other when I was 14. I'm 27 now. Most people don't believe me when I tell them what I saw, but I know I'm not crazy or was just seeing things because 2 of my friends also saw it, and it terrified the heck out of them. I live in southern Illinois. When I was younger, I used to hang out with my friend Ty at his grandma's house. My mom was a good friend with his grandma and great-grandma, so we went out there almost every weekend to see them. He and his brother would stay there during the summer, so all their friends, including myself, would go and stay with them for days at a time. As you could imagine, it could get pretty cramped, but they lived in the country, so we were usually outside. At some point, we ended up moving in with his grandma, staying with them for a short time. Their grandma lived in a double-wide trailer, and his great-grandma lived in a small house that sat on a little hill about 10 feet from his grandma's trailer. They lived on the outskirts of town and were surrounded by a large set of woods and open cow fields. They had some neighbors, but they were pretty spread out because they were farmers. Behind their homes was another huge field for the neighbors' cows, and a long barbed wire fence wrapping around it that seemed like it went on for miles, dividing the woods and the property lines. Directly behind his great-grandma's house was the large rusty metal gate. One day as we were getting ready to go outside, we overheard his grandma telling my mom how the neighbors had to move their cows out of the field behind her house because something was attacking and killing their cattle. We could tell by the way they were talking they didn't want us to know about it. Unfortunately for them, we had listened to their entire conversation. As we walked into the living room, they quickly changed the subject. We pretended to hear nothing and started going outside. His grandma spoke up, telling us to stay out of the open field. Ty took the opportunity to ask questions in hopes they'd tell us what was going on. But they didn't. She simply said it was their property and we needed to stay out, But we had other plans. When we knew everyone was asleep, me, Ty, and our friend Shay decided to go and investigate these mysterious cow murders. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning, and the moon was bright and full in the sky, making it easier for us to get around. The field was very open, and there were hay bales pushed over to the left side of the fence. On the right side were the woods. They went on for miles, and they were very thick. The fence ended just in front of the tree line. We went in, leaving the gate open, and started searching for anything suspicious. For the most part, nothing seemed unusual, beside the cows not being in there. Just before we got to the end of the fence, in front of the tree line, we found a dead, mangled coyote that looked like it hadn't been there for very long. We only started to smell its rotten stench when we got right up on top of it. We didn't know what it was at first. Ty and I shined our flashlights on it, and almost couldn't tell it was even a coyote. I had bent down to get a better look, while Ty stood beside me. We had our backs turned directly in front of the tree line. Shay was about 2 feet away from the coyote because it made her feel sick, but she was still facing us. By this time, she was starting to get scared, and she was ready for us to leave. But we were too busy trying to figure out what had killed this coyote. She repeated herself a couple times that we needed to leave and that she didn't want to do this anymore, but we just kept telling her to hold on. At about that time, we heard something let out this deep, guttural, low growl. It was coming from behind us in the woods. We all stopped and got real quiet. I looked behind me, still crouched as they shined their lights into the woods. It was silent for a moment. You could hear a pin drop. Then we heard it again. This time, it sounded louder, as if it had gotten closer somehow without us hearing it. I finally stood up and faced the woods, shining my light in the same direction, but I couldn't see anything. "What the heck is that?" I asked. I was feeling pretty freaked out, but I didn't want to show it. I thought it was a big dog, maybe, but the growls were like nothing I'd ever heard before. It sounded really big and almost demonic. Before I had any time to react, Shay screamed at the top of her lungs and dropped her flashlight in a panic, running back toward the house. We panicked and took off behind her. I didn't know what she saw, but I didn't want to wait around to find out. All of a sudden, I heard rustling and crunching as something big and fast was coming out of the woods, followed by a horrendous, roaring growl. Pure terror struck me, and the adrenaline was coursing through my body. It leapt over the fence, hitting the ground hard and charging after us. I could hear the ground stomping under its feet as it kept coming. Shay was screaming ahead of us. I tried to turn back and see if Ty was keeping up, and I saw it, towering over the top of him. This enormous, black, furry creature was right there. I could see its black, furry mane and long, pointed ears sticking over its head like that of a wolf or dog. I couldn't believe the size of it. I know we were just kids, but Ty was a 14-year-old boy and he was pretty tall for his age. But this thing stood a good 5 foot something on all fours. I turned around, screaming for my life, trying to run faster, but I knew it was gaining on us. We were all screaming at this point, running across the field. I was hoping so desperately that someone would hear us and try to help, but we were so far out there, it was almost impossible. The creature kept roaring that blood-curdling sound. It was like something from the pits of hell, easily the most terrifying thing I'd ever heard. I kept looking back in hopes that he was okay and to get a better look at this thing, but it never moved out from behind him. As soon as we made it through the gate, we slammed it shut and locked it as if that rusty, busted-up metal gate was going to do anything against that thing. We searched the area frantically as we gasped for air, but it was gone. Not a trace of it. How could something so big, so loud, just disappear? It was possible it stopped and ran back into the woods without us knowing in our panicked mindset, but why? It could have easily killed us, just like those cows. Either way, I thank God I was able to live and tell about it. We ran back to his grandma's trailer, trying to be quiet, but got caught by his brother. We told him what had happened, but he didn't believe us at all, just made jokes. His attitude changed real quick, though. The next night, we heard something outside the trailer. Their great-grandma called their grandma and said she heard someone or something messing around her house. So Ty's grandma grabbed her shotgun, and her and his brother went out to see what was going on. It wasn't long before they came back and he looked like he had seen a ghost. His face was pale and he was real quiet. That was unlike him. His grandma demanded that we stay in at night, but nobody would tell us what had happened. We tried to get him to tell us, but he refused to talk about it. It frightened him so bad that it gave him nightmares for a while. All he said was, "I believe you." We never went back into the woods after that, and when it got dark, we got in the house quickly, especially during the full moon. That was the last time any of us saw it out there, and no one seems to know what it was. Everyone thought it was a bobcat, but I beg to differ. This thing was bigger than any bobcat I've ever seen, and we don't have bears or wolves around here. So, what was it? My second encounter was a bit different. I was 14 and we lived in a housing duplex. We were surrounded by apartments on all sides. Directly behind us was a big open field, spacing out the other apartments. 2 on the left, 2 on the right, and 3 directly behind us. Facing the ones behind ours was a road, and right on the other side was a huge field with a little old abandoned building sitting in the middle. A few yards away in the field, to the left, was a house that owned part of the property, and way on the end, to the right, a few yards away from the building, was the football practice area. Beyond the field, just past the building, was a pond that was surrounded by tall grass and cattails. A little further out, surrounding the entire area, was deep, dense woods that led on to the next town. One night I was out playing a hide-and-go-seek tag type of game with my neighbor friends. Everything was normal. We did this all the time. After everyone was caught, we went to the front of the apartments by my place and soon realized that one of our friends was still out there hiding. We yelled for him and told him the game was over, but nobody knew where he actually was. So we started looking for him and kept calling his name. We searched all over the front area for him, but nobody could find him, and he wasn't answering any of us, which we thought was really strange. I decided to go look for him in the field towards the woods, because that's where all the boys would hide when the grass grew high. It was the perfect hiding place, especially at night. I made my way to the road and was looking around. I soon got to the streetlight. Just at the edge of the field by the road, there are a set of trees. Not very big and not very many, maybe about 7 in all, placed in a row and spaced out about 12 feet apart. In between a set of 2 trees, I saw a figure that appeared to be crouched in the tall grass. I knew it had to be him. I walked up to him and said, "Hey, come on. The game is over, you won. Everyone's been looking for you." But he never replied. I stopped directly in front of him about 8 or 9 feet away and stood in the gravel in the road. The grass was really high that night. Walking into it, it would have come up to my waist or a little higher, so it was over his head while he was crouched, and it was hard to really see him, but I knew he was there by the dark figure. I said his name a few times and asked him why he wasn't responding, but he never said anything. I was starting to wonder if this was really him or not. I leaned forward a little bit, staring at the figure for a minute, and I started to realize that what I'd been talking to resembled an animal, more so a dog. So of course, I started talking to it again. "Oh, hi baby, what are you doing?" I said, thinking that I'm now talking to a pretty good-sized dog, just sitting in the tall grass. I talked to it a few more times, but it didn't move or make a sound. I looked around and was starting to feel a little creeped out. It was dark, I was alone, and I'd finally noticed how foggy the field was in the tall grass. Among all that, I also noticed I didn't hear my friends yelling anymore. I didn't like the atmosphere I was in, and I was beginning to get a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I looked back down at the dog, and I saw it start to stand up, but it didn't stand onto all fours like I expected it to. No, it kept rising. I slowly watched this thing stand straight up on two legs, and it went way over my head. It was hunched over, covered in thick black fur. Its arms were bent, and its paw-like hands were down in front of its waist area. Its legs were bent exactly like that of a dog, and it had a long, thick black tail. It stood at least 3 or 4 feet taller than me, and I was around 5'1". It was strangely built, like a person, but it wasn't especially muscular, just really tall and really furry. I knew what I was staring at had to be the same thing that attacked me and my friends 4 years earlier. I was frightened. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there and stared at it. I couldn't quite make out its facial structure, but I knew it had a snout. It didn't make a sound, and neither did I. I slowly started to take a step back, and it mimicked me, taking a step forward. I was horrified. I wanted to run, but I was afraid it would attack me right there and then. I slowly took a few more steps and watched it come a little closer. I finally got the courage to run and ran as fast as I could, almost falling into a ditch. I ran across the road, over the sidewalk, through someone's yard, and in between 2 apartments, leading into the open field. I saw my apartment and kept running until I was almost in my neighbor's yard, before turning to look back. It wasn't following me, but I was too scared to stop and went around to the front where everyone else was at. I ran to the group of them and stopped in a panic, trying to catch my breath. They then asked me where I had been and that our friend was in his house the whole time. I was too shaken up to talk, and I was still out of breath. My girlfriends knew something was wrong. I calmed down a bit and finally told them what I saw, but the boys just laughed at me. "I'm not kidding. I saw it," I yelled, getting mad. One of the boys laughed and said, "It was probably just a big beaver." I couldn't believe it. "Really? A beaver? Beavers don't stand 8 feet tall," I continued. But they laughed and wanted to see what was out there. I was hesitant at first because I already knew how dangerous it was, if it was in fact the same thing I saw before. But they were determined to see it. We went out there, but it was already gone. I stayed alert in case it came back, but it never did. We looked around and some of the boys went further into the field, but it was too foggy and the grass was too high to see anything. I showed them where it was and saw that the grass where it had been crouching was disturbed. It was obvious something was here, but they continued to make their jokes. The next day, I wanted to go out there and look for any evidence that may have been there that we didn't see, but I had to babysit, so my girlfriends went instead. I don't know if it was true or not, but they swore they found huge dog-like footprints out by the woods. They found them in the mud by the pond and followed them until they stopped at a tree. When they took me to see it, the people who owned the property came out and threatened us, telling us to leave. I never saw anything else like that out there again, but I did notice strange sounds at night, out in the woods. Every so often, me and some other people would hear weird howls that almost sounded like a person screaming, but howling at the same time too. It wasn't like any type of howls I've ever heard, but everyone brushed them off as coyotes crying. I don't believe that for a second. I don't know what they were, but the best way I can describe them was they were, well, werewolves. As crazy as that sounds, I can't think of anything else they could have been. I haven't seen anything since that day, or heard any of those strange sounds since I moved out of the apartment, but I know they're still out there, somewhere, watching.
Bud Abbott and Lou Costello.
Presenting Abbott and Costello, the official podcast of Abbott and Costello's old-time radio shows.
I was standing next to a blimp. All of a sudden, an officer points to me and says, "Look, they're making them with faces now."
Hear all the classic comedy from the legendary duo.
What is on second base? I'm not asking you who's on second. Who's on first? One base at a time.
Digitally remastered and restored the way they were meant to be heard. Abbott and Costello. Listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
On my way home, from Jake L. I live in a city with my mom and my younger brother. We own 4 shops in my village, which has now basically started to develop into a small town. The city in which I live is 25 miles away from it. My father often visits us every 2 or 3 days, as it can be difficult to commute daily. We have a huge bungalow in the village where my uncle, aunt, and grandparents live with my father. My mom, along with my younger brother, settled in the town 15 years ago from our village for my education. So whenever we have festivals or celebrations, we have to travel back to our village a few days prior to the event. Well, I was in my village one night. It was late, around 10:30 p.m. I had to drop my other cousin off at his house, which was about 5 miles away from ours. So I took my scooter instead of my sports bike, since it was much more comfortable to drive, after my stomach was full from a great feast we had. There were 2 roads for us to take to reach his house. One was the normal street where vehicles drive very often, while the other was a shortcut, but it was pebbled and not maintained well. There were often some strange and paranormal sightings on this road, according to the local villagers, and the forest surrounding it really gave off a spooky vibe. Since my cousin and I had a great interest in ghost stories and legends, we decided to go down this shortcut road. It was a full moon night, so the only lights on the road were my headlights and the moonlight. We started telling some scary stories to each other, settling into the eerie atmosphere. We soon made it to his house. My uncle and aunt were asking me to spend the night, as it was already late, but I'd have to be in the city early in the morning, so I couldn't stay. As I left their house, I asked them not to worry too much, since I would call them as soon as I made it home. I began to make my way back. I decided to use the same pebbled road. As soon as I began to drive down the road, a chill went through my spine, which startled me. It was like my instincts were telling me to turn back. I shook off the feeling, then I put in my headphones, playing music from my phone. It soon began to sink in, despite the headphones, that I was alone, and the surrounding forest was creepy. When I would turn and have to have my back turned towards it, it felt as if something was about to tackle me from behind. I ignored this sensation as best I could, and drove another 2 miles. Suddenly, I spotted a woman walking on the side of the road. She looked completely normal, and as the village was just a mile ahead, I thought she would be bothered by me offering her a lift, so I drove further ahead of her. After driving further, I saw the same woman walking ahead of me, which made me anxious. I thought to myself, how could someone walk or run so fast without me seeing them pass me by, even though she had been right behind me on the same road? I began to panic a bit, so I sped up. Now here's where it gets really creepy. I don't know why I looked in the rear mirror of my scooter, but when I did, I'll never forget what I saw. It was the same woman, except now she was running after me. I was terrified, so I began to accelerate even more, and yet she was still gaining on me. The faster I went, the more she gained. What scared me the most was when she was chasing me, her hands were stretched forward, and her nails looked horrifically sharp. For a moment, as I stared at her through the mirror, the shadows of the nearby trees broke, and the moonlight revealed more of her. That feeling of fear and helplessness grew. She had extremely pale skin, eyes pure white, and just a black spot in the pupils. Her teeth were extremely sharp, like some sort of predator instead of a human, and her mouth was wide open, more than humanly possible. She wore a pure black dress. Just looking at her chasing after me like that, my eyes went teary from the sight. I was glancing a few times in the mirror when I then saw her get down on her hands, now running on legs and hands like an animal chasing prey. At that moment, I thought I was going to die, but still, with all the adrenaline pumping inside me, I drove to the max speed my scooter would allow. I stopped looking back, trying to focus on driving and getting away. After a few minutes, I don't know how, but when I finally did look back again, she was gone. When I exited that road and reached my village, I slowed down and stopped near a police station, which was just at the start of the village. Seeing me with such desperation and a frightened look, the officer patrolling at the time asked me what happened. I wanted to speak so badly. I wanted to tell him how happy I was to see him, but not a single word came out. Instead of speaking, I looked back one last time to make sure the woman was really gone. But my jaw dropped at what I saw. I shivered, my eyes wide open. That woman was standing right there at the start of the road, as if she was unable to cross it. She gave me a smile so wicked, as if she was telling me she had fun chasing me that night, that she was glad I was there to entertain her for the night. Slowly, she backed and faded away into the dark forest. The officer asked me again and again, but still, not a single word came out. The officer took me home. When I made it home, I felt a warm and cozy feeling come over me, and finally tears began to roll down my eyes. I was so glad and felt so fortunate to be alive, to be home. When my family saw me in such a state, instead of asking about the situation, they just sat me down on the couch. Eventually, I calmed down a bit, and I explained the situation, which I cannot believe or didn't even know how to comprehend. To my surprise, they all believed me, and were much relieved knowing that I wasn't harmed. My grandparents then told me that there were a few recent cases in the village about people seeing a woman on that road, chasing down whoever walked or drove on it, but never actually harmed anyone. The next day, I came back here in the city. It's been 2 days since the incident as of writing this. I still feel so lucky, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened to me if the woman had caught me, or if my scooter had broken down. I know one thing. I'm safe now, but I won't be able to visit my village anymore. At least not for a certain time. Artillery versus Mythology, from 19 Delta Scout. My mother had arranged for one of my cousins to pick me up from the international airport in Manila during my last visit to the Philippines. Being Filipino myself, it seemed like every time I returned to visit my parents' native country, I'm introduced to hundreds more cousins and relatives, which I never knew I had. I had never met this cousin, whom I'll call Juan, who came to pick me up on a warm tropical evening. It was near midnight, but Manila was still alive with the lights and sounds and hustle and bustle of a crowded metro city. My cousin Juan, a slender young man sporting a military-style haircut, picked me up in an older model van, and after tossing my baggage in the back, we began the long and slow trip out of the city. I was on block leave from the army, having just returned from a deployment to the